Hello, I'm Andrew Susskind, and I'm a psychotherapist and author based on the west side of Los Angeles since 1992, specializing in trauma and addictive compulsive behaviors. Welcome to my podcast, named after my recent book and workbook, It's Not About the Sex. Here we have direct and honest conversations related to compulsive sexual behavior and trauma, all from a sexual health perspective. Our intention is to offer fresh viewpoints and practical strategies toward establishing greater intimacy and a more deeply connected life. Let's begin. Chapter 7, Cultivating Contentment. In the year 2000, I met my coach, Sam, who was on the faculty of my coach training program. I was introduced to the brand new field of positive psychology, the science of happiness. Although Sam and I primarily focused on my core values and future goals, she wasn't afraid to help me look at the barriers to my happiness, typically stale messages and old fears from my past. I found it was impossible to experience gratitude, purpose, and direction without keeping an eye on my trauma reactions. Even the father of positive psychology, Dr. Martin Seligman, started his career studying learned helplessness, which he eventually turned upside down to study learned optimism. Therefore, contentment and suffering can coexist. It doesn't have to be one or the other, but where we choose to focus our attention grows exponentially. Today, I hold my childhood trauma with a lighter touch. Acceptance, connection, and love get more of my attention. When I fall into a trauma reaction, I try to be curious and non-judgmental, being the best parent to the little kid inside of me. When I'm spending a nourishing afternoon with a friend or playing with my dog, I do my best to savor those experiences and not take them for granted. In other words, savoring contentment is a daily practice, which also helps me keep an eye on the brokenheartedness in the rearview mirror.
I loved your personal stories.
What do you love about them, Sue?
I don't know. It's just like a little glimpse into Andrew, and just nice little reminders of how you go about your day.
Yeah. Well, I included this particular personal story because I think that contentment is more than just contentment, right? It's really about having the fullness of our emotional range,
Mm-hmm.
right? What's going on inside of us. And I think it's really important to normalize the fact that contentment is sometimes aspirational and sometimes it's achievable, but not always. Just like anything, it is a practice. And I use the word contentment, by the way, because honestly, I feel like joy is really based on fleeting moments. Very difficult, I believe, to sustain joy. Happiness is being studied all the time by the positive psychologists and lots of folks out there. But for me personally, I lean in the direction of contentment because it's more about inner peace. It's more about feeling comfortable in my skin. And somehow it feels more sustainable.
Yeah, I like what you're saying, Andrew. And knowing your core values is an advanced part of recovery. How does someone actually even identify their core values? Because I find that that's a struggle.
Right. So core values are in the neighborhood of knowing what we really want, well, what we really want and what we really desire, right? So we're talking about fundamental parts of who we are that often, especially with addiction and compulsions and trauma, get somehow pushed to the side. It's like that inner voice somehow gets lost. And so core values is an advanced part of recovery. It's not for the someone who's just brand new into recovery. It's certainly not for someone who's still active in their addiction or compulsive type activities. But what I really think of is the question, what really matters most to you, right? What really matters most to you? And why don't we try this just for a quick moment, Sue? When I say that out loud, what really matters most to you? What comes up without overthinking it?
I think like honesty, dependability, loyalty.
Hmm. Yeah, and that's fantastic because without even having to think much about it, you know what really matters most to you. And because I've known you a long time, I know that those things are integral to who you are. And that's what we're really looking for when we're thinking about core values. And this is something, by the way, that coaches pretty much across the board will try and help their clients discover, right? It's almost like discovering a dormant voice sometimes. And there's another values clarification exercise. There's probably dozens of them. But the idea is to not try and figure it out or overanalyze it, but simply say what rises to the top, right? For me, it might be things like productivity, contribution, authenticity, and everything that you said as well. So it's really a way of starting to look at what matters most, what is the foundation of what counts to you, and how can that set the tone for what we're going to talk about in a minute. Okay, so we'll go on in that way.
Yeah, that's fantastic. And I think sometimes bringing up a list of what values exist. Like I did this not that long ago because we were talking about this in one of my groups. I'm like, Let's get a list of values together." And people were like, "Oh, yeah, I have that value." It was like just to simply remind yourself of the things that are, because sometimes they're buried and we don't think of these things every day.
Right. And it's really like a rediscovery or a reclaiming
Hmm.
because it's there, but it's been put aside, right? Somewhere on the back burner or even further beyond that. So, so in the context of sexual recovery, there might be a focus on what are my sexual values? What are
Hmm.
my sexual goals? And eventually, what is my sexual vision? Do I have a vision for how I want to express myself sexually? And these are big questions. So again, advanced part of recovery,
Hmm.
not to be taken lightly. And honestly, it's something that I always recommend somebody does with someone else, whether that be with a therapist or a counselor or a coach or a sponsor.
Hmm.
And when we're talking about sexual values, goals, vision, etc., it could be things like emotional risk taking. It could be things like play. It could be things like having fun. It could be things like, what's really an erotic turn on, right? So it's all these possibilities that really are a part of what we're going to be talking about at another point, actually, which is reclaiming sexual health.
So, Andrew, most of us know about creating a vision, and you're really good at doing that and helping us through that. But what is visioning exactly?
Well, it actually goes back to a particular exercise that was developed by a person named Jack Canfield. For
Hmm.
those of you who remember, he was the person who developed the Chicken Soup for the Soul series. And beyond that, he's really a master coach. And he wrote a book many years ago called The Success Principles. And it's a really good book. It really does outline a lot of things that are so foundational in coaching and moving forward with your life and career, et cetera. But the thing that really caught my attention was this idea of visioning. And let me talk about it in terms of my own experience with this.
Mm.
I was working with a coach back in 2001. I mentioned her name, Sam Foster was her full name. And Sam said to me, she said, it's not that anything has to happen, but it's simply what could happen, right? It's not that anything has to happen, but it's simply what could happen. So she really opened the aperture and said, why don't you just play with the possibilities and don't get locked into anything, but start to imagine, kind of like Disney with Imagineering, imagine a bigger, better life, right? Something that's more satisfying, something that's more fun, something that's more flexible, etc. So I took the visioning exercise from Jack Canfield's book and I just started writing. And Sam said, you know what? Don't do it at home unless you feel you must. Take the exercise somewhere beautiful that's inspiring for you. And I did two things. I actually took about 2 weeks on this exercise, and I took it on a hike with me, and I just wrote, tried not to censor, but just kind of wrote and free associated. And then the next week, I took it to the beach, and I looked at what I wrote, and I added to it, and I subtracted from it. But what I really was doing was I was letting myself imagine the highest level of health I could have, the highest level of relationships, personal growth, contribution or volunteering, how I wanted my finances to look, how I wanted my work life to look, and how I wanted my free time to look. So I looked at a lot of different dimensions of my life and just started to imagine what would it look like a year from now, 12 months from now if I did all that. Or I think at the time Sam said, well, if that feels like too much, you can also do a 90-day vision. What do you want things to look like in 90 days? So for a recovering perfectionist like myself, this was a breath of fresh air because I felt no pressure. I felt a lot of expansiveness. And it was almost like I was, I don't know, a teenager or a young adult where I was just had this blank canvas and I just wrote. So really that's the story of how I used visioning. There's a lot of different ways to do it. And I've done it through the years in different ways, both for myself and with my clients.
What a wonderful exercise. Like that feeling, well, as you're explaining it, is like, yeah, I get that. It feels so good to be able to do that.
It was honestly one of the most powerful writing exercises I've ever done. And I was also inspired by working with Sam, but it was just a moment in time that truly was like a turn in what I was doing from kind of going one direction to considering all kinds of directions.
Right. Yeah. Let's look at all these different categories and see what you can create from that.
Exactly.
Once someone's developing their vision and identifies their core values, and that's interesting just to align those together,
Exactly.
it's time now to develop some purposeful goals.
Absolutely. I mean, in my very first workbook, I called everything purposeful. So, whether it be a purposeful value or a purposeful vision or a purposeful goal or a
It serves a
purposeful
purpose.
connection, right? It served a lot of purposes. And so purposeful goals to me is really, again, asking myself what is truly in alignment with my core values and with my vision. So a lot of people go right to goals, goal setting, goal setting, goal setting. And that sometimes can be the cart before the horse. And I used to do that. That was my way of trying to figure out what do I really want to do and how am I going to get there. But I love the idea of truly slowing down and being in alignment because if something's out of alignment with my core values, it's probably not going to be something to pursue.
Hmm.
If something's out of alignment with my vision, it's probably something I'm not going to pursue either. I mean, it's just
Right.
not
Yeah.
really going to be, it's not going to have the momentum or the energy behind it. But I go back to something called SMART goals, which I think you're familiar with
Hmm.
as well, Sue. And SMART goals, for those who don't know, are specific, measurable, achievable, relevant, and time-bound. So SMART is an acronym: specific, measurable, achievable, relevant, and time-bound. And once we start to play with that, and again, I think goal setting doesn't have to be something that's rigid, right? I actually prefer the word intentions over goals, although I think they both have energy that is something that anybody can choose to language it the way they want to. But if a SMART goal is really in alignment with core values and vision, guess what? It's going to have purpose behind it. And purpose is really a spiritual, existential concept, really. It's ultimately about what gives your life meaning, what gives your career meaning, what gives your relationships meaning. So it's all of the above. And that's why I think there's something about cultivating contentment that has to do with excavating what really matters most and what you really want and desire.
Yeah, I love that. And I think sometimes people get hung up on purpose as being like one purpose, but you'll realize that it's a lot of things. It doesn't have to just be like this one purpose that you're trying to find. And I love finding some not some easy goals to be successful with when you're first starting this. Like set a very easy goal for yourself. E- Even like I'm gonna drink more water this week or something that you can accomplish. So you get that feeling of like, oh, okay, I can actually accomplish this and it's something good for me. And it feels good. Reward yourself. Go get a cup of tea or something, like and create this feeling of momentum when you start to set these goals for yourself.
Right. I call those bite-sized chunks
I like
where
that. I like that.
hopefully we can break things down and make things achievable. Sometimes stretch goals are significant, right? But we can also map out stretch goals and bite-sized chunks at the same time. We don't have to do it all
Oh
at
yeah.
once, especially in kind of rebuilding these muscles or creating new neural pathways around this. There's something about taking your time and, like you said, building that sense of confidence or agency once you're able to take care of those smaller things and then building up to some stretch goals beyond that.
hmm So I like to ask you this, how does gratitude fit into this discussion of contentment?
I'm really glad you asked because it's essential. It's actually what I consider one of the essential ingredients for contentment. A lot of folks say, well, oh, it's just something Oprah talks about, or it's just something that
Mm,
it's kind of pop psychology, and what good is it really? But what's interesting is in the 12-step rooms and in the positive psychology research, there is a lot of understanding nowadays that it's actually about training the brain to
hmm
lean in the direction of savoring or counting your blessings, some of the researchers call it. In the 12-step rooms, oftentimes people will talk about the attitude of gratitude, right? And I think that was even before all the positive psychology research
Oh yeah.
emerged. So in the context of contentment, um, it's all about building a higher life satisfaction level, right? So that's what the positive psychologists are finding is that when there's a gratitude practice, and it doesn't have to be a big one, it could be naming one gratitude every single day, just noticing one thing in your experience that you're grateful for, that there's something about that actually fuels our life satisfaction. And it's becoming more and more evident that there's not only a direct correlation, but the more attention that the brain is putting on gratitude, the more sense of life fulfillment grows.
Yeah, I see it as like paying it forward, right? You're saying something in the moment, but you're going to benefit from it. The, that gratitude piece is important.
Hmm.
What else helps us, do you think, cultivate contentment?
There's lots and lots of things, but for the sake of our conversation today, I'm going to talk for a moment about connection. As many of our listeners know, I also often credit Johann Hari for his quote the opposite of addiction isn't sobriety. The opposite of addiction is connection. And I sometimes refer to the trifecta of connection, and how I refer to it is that the connection within, the connection with ourselves, number one, the connection with emotionally reliable people in our lives, number two, and the connection with something bigger than ourselves. That could be God or higher power. It could be universal energy. It could be pets. It could be nature. It's anything that's bigger than us, right? So that's the spiritual piece. And so if this, speaking for myself, if I have connection with myself, right, where I'm feeling more content, where I'm feeling comfortable in my skin, if I'm feeling connection with the love in my life, the relationships that matter so much to me, if I'm feeling some connection with God, as I call higher power, I know my life and my recovery is going to go smoother, right? But if any one of those is not sturdy, things get a little wobbly. And so it's a reminder, it's actually a call to action to reconnect with anything that is feeling disconnected in one way or the other.
That all makes sense. And I love that you include the pets in there because really the pets do bring us unconditional love. I remember one summer I was a dog walker and it was the best job ever because you open the door and you just greeted and they don't care anything. Like they're just so happy to see you and it's just the nicest feeling.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, any sources of unconditional love, you and I, of course, have our dogs who are, you know, irreplaceable
Hmm.
and in our hearts very deeply. But any sources that come our way, and it can be unexpected sometimes, but just being aware of what am I feeling grateful for, where am I feeling connected, and what's happening inside, am I feeling more content?
It's wonderful. Good
So
questions.
yeah, I mean they're huge questions. I mean, in some ways it sounds so simple, but in other ways they're very profound.
Yeah, for
So
sure. Yeah.
So why don't we go to the end of the chapter and as we've done before, read out loud the section that I call your practice. And this is really for our listeners to know that there's certain things that you can do, right? This is not just conceptual stuff. And that's really the reason I wrote the workbook in the first place is it's not just about understanding and awareness and insight, which is all great, but it's also about putting one foot in front of the other. And so we're going to read from the end of chapter 7, Your Practice. And number 1 goes like this. Contentment is only one dimension of the human condition. Holding the intention for happiness, joy, or contentment allows you to keep your eye on this part of you.
Number 2, core values and sexual values help you soul search what really matters most to you. Not to our culture, not to our families, not to anybody else, but to you.
Number 3, goals and intentions give you room to play with the infinite possibilities in front of you. The good news is that you're never locked into anything. They simply offer a direction which can be re-navigated at any time.
Number 4, visioning is an opportunity to open the aperture and see what you might want to explore.
And 5, gratitude provides the glue to contentment and inner peace. Thanks for listening today. It was so terrific sharing the time with my colleague and close friend, Sue Merlino, and discussing this really meaningful topic. If you're so inclined, please give us a 5-star rating and be sure to subscribe and share my podcast with those who may benefit. I look forward to you joining us the next time, and don't forget to stay connected.